All right, welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar with cybersecurity expert Derek A. Smith, a modular and integrated approach to managing and protecting your Unix Linux privileged accounts. It's going to be a good one. You're also joined by Beyond Trust product manager Paul Harper, who will run us through a Beyond Trust overview towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we will cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 business day from now. So at this point, I'd like to hand it on over to Derek, who will jump right in. Hello, Derek. Welcome to the line. Take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for having me. Again, I'm Derek Smith, and as you can see, I do a lot of cyber stuff. I talk about cyber on television. I'm a professor for 25 years in cyber, and I work in cyber, and I do a lot of cyber stuff. So I love talking about it as well. So I want to get right into it because I have a lot of stuff I want to share with you all today. And I want to start with an introduction before I get into this slide. But basically, most of you know what privileged accounts are. And you know that they're a necessity in any enterprise IT environment that we have. Our administrators, they have to have these enhanced privileges in order to manage that environment. But as you all probably know, privileged accounts also introduce some serious compliance and security risks for us and in our organizations. Excuse me. In particular, those privileged accounts are often what we call all or nothing. For example, in a Unix environment, since that's what we're talking about, enabling a help desk member to perform even simple password resets requires granting them full administrative rights. And that can be misused either intentionally or by accident, of course. And also, when we look at privileged accounts, they're difficult to manage. Any type of privileged account, I don't care if it's Unix or whatever. And by the way, the things I'm going to talk about today, they can be used for, any kind of environments, but we're focusing on Unix today. So since a lot of people and systems need access to the same credentials, it's difficult for us to keep those credentials secure and to change them on a regular basis like we should be doing, and especially to hold people accountable for the actions they take using those credentials. I was looking at the I know all you probably read this, but the Verizon data breach investigation report, it found that 76% of breaches exploited weak or stolen credentials. And, that's one of the biggest things. And then what happens? Those people become insiders because they're using credentials that we think should be there. It also said that 13% resulted from privilege misuse and abuse once those people get in using our credentials, and then they escalate their privileges. So this webinar, I'm going to focus on how you can protect your organization by outlining some clear steps or some modules that I have that you can use to mitigate your security risks or your privileged accounts. Okay. So let me start with what you see highlighted here. What is a privileged account, or what is a privileged account management at least? So it's sometimes called privilege identity managed or privilege access managed or whatever you want to call it. But basically it focuses on controlling and auditing access to administrative or privileged accounts. And those accounts have the rights necessary for us to perform administrative tasks like setting up an account or resetting somebody's password or installing some software updates and a lot of other things. But managing them, again, have its own set of challenges, and I'm going to talk about those challenges in just a second. But I have a few things before I get to that. So your Unix and your Linux systems often house your organization's most critical applications and your most sensitive data. And due to that inherently siloed nature that it has and that most of those systems possess, a lot of organizations struggle on how they can effectively and efficiently secure, control, and monitor those privileged accounts and those credentials in their Unix and Linux environments. So as a result of that, those sensitive accounts and those credentials, which can be used to access sensitive data, change system settings, delete audit logs, and all that, they're often left unprotected from malicious and unauthorized users. So to protect our Unix and Linux account, I'm just going to say our Unix accounts and credentials in a uniform and effective way, we have to be able to control or have controls that centrally manage privileged accounts throughout the enterprise. and we need to be able to secure and rotate those privileged account credentials and proactively secure our privileged user sessions, and as I said before, continuously monitor our privileged accounts to detect any type of anomalous behavior that we have. Now, there are two specific categories of accounts. We have our user accounts, and we have our privileged accounts. So let's start with the user account. That user account takes the form of an account usually used by a person. And well, a privileged account can be used by a person also, but I'm talking about your regular user. So every user account is going to have a password associated with it. And that password is going to allow you to access that account and for you to conduct your daily business. So those passwords that we have for those accounts exist for our own protection and for us to protect that information from anybody else accessing it or access our user account without permission. Now that privileged account can be human or it can be non-human. And they exist for us to allow IT professionals to manage those applications that I talked about earlier, or some software or server hardware or whatever it may be. So those privileged accounts provide that administrative or those specialized levels of access based on some type of higher level permissions that are shared throughout the organization. Now, some types of those human privileged accounts are application accounts, and they're used to run services requiring some type of specific permission. And the user accounts can also have those elevated or administrative privileges attached to those as well, but they are distinguished about how you use these. Now, like the user account, those privileged accounts have passwords to control access also. And the problem that we have is that with user and both those privileged account passwords is that a lot of tools exist that hackers can use for cracking those passwords. That's one of our biggest problems. So after that hacker gets access to that password protected system, they can cause a lot of damage. And as you all know, that damage can be catastrophic and cost us a lot of money and also cost us our reputation. Hijacking our privileged accounts give those attackers the ability to access and download our organization's most sensitive data, which is something we don't want. They can also distribute malware in our systems. They can bypass our security controls. They can erase audit trails and a lot of other things. They can even hide their activities so we won't even know they're there. A good hacker won't do all these things. They won't erase, they won't damage your system. They want to stay there as long as possible so they can continue to get that good stuff that they get, right? So in most organizations, your IT staff are going to have one account, and that account is going to have their standard level permissions. They should have that as their user account. They shouldn't use their super account to go out and do other things. But that other account, that super account is going to be used for them to perform operations that require those elevated privileges. Let me just give you an idea of some of the different types of accounts that we have. I don't have them on this slide, but we have like our local administrative accounts. And those are non-personal accounts that provide administrative access to a local host. And they're going to be usually used by IT staff to perform maintenance on workstations and servers and network devices and stuff like that. Now, that shared password can be used against thousands or across thousands of hosts. And that creates soft targets for the bad guys. And they routinely exploit these type of things. We have what's called our privileged user account that I just described, and those are credentials that give administrative privileges on one or more systems. And those accounts usually have some type of unique or complex password, and the power that those wield across those managed systems, that makes it necessary for us to continually monitor the use of those, because that's where the bad stuff happens. We have something called domain administrative accounts, and those give privileged administrative access across all the workstations and servers within a particular domain. So there might not be that many of those, it might just be a few of those, but they provide the most extensive and the most robust access to our network or across our network. Okay, if somebody was to get complete control over all our domain controllers, they would be able to modify the membership of every administrative account within a domain, and then they compromise their credentials, and that's, worst case scenario if that was to happen. We have emergency accounts. I did an entire webinar for Beyond Trust on emergency accounts, because these are unprivileged users with administrative access that they can get in case of an emergency. What I call this is break glass. These are break glass accounts, okay? And while access to these accounts usually requires some type of manager approval for security reasons, it's usually a manual process that's inefficient and lacks any auditability that gets you to that break glass account. Two more. Have a service account, and these can be privileged local or domain accounts that's used by an application or a service that we have to interact with our operating system. Now, in some cases, what happens with these service accounts is that they have administrative privileges tied to them depending on the requirements of that application that they're being used for. So those local service accounts can interact with a lot of different network components that we have, and that makes the password changes that we have to do for those accounts difficult. And that usually means that the passwords are rarely changed, and of course that can be a significant risk across our enterprise too. And the last ones are application accounts. Now those are accounts used by applications to access databases and run batch jobs and things like that. So those passwords for those accounts are often embedded and stored in some type of encrypted text file. And a vulnerability that is replicated across multiple servers provide fault tolerance and things like that for applications. But it represents also a significant risk to us because the applications are often the exact data that advanced persistent threats and hackers and things like that are looking for. So we have to make sure that we're protecting those. So those are some of the accounts that we have, and unfortunately a lot of these accounts are often misused. So to keep things running and to avoid application downtime and insufficient privileges and all that kind of stuff, we have to make sure that we have some good practices in place that's going to keep our passwords and our access management and all that kind of stuff safe. So I'm going to talk about that today. Okay. All right. Real quick, user versus super user count, kind of describe that, but a user count usually represents, as I said before, a human identity, such as if you had Active Directory or something like that, a user account. And usually I said it has a password and it has, in it to restrict access to that account. And usually just a single password per human user that we have distributed to. Now that privileged account, again, can be human or non-human, as I told you, and does not necessarily represent human beings. So an example of that would include an application account that's shared by IT staff or, something like that. So those privileged account passwords of course, should be set to very large, complex values and stored in a secure vault. And I'm going to talk about secure vaulting as I go on in this presentation. Okay, if we properly stored or properly vaulted, those accounts don't need to be memorized or don't need to be written down somewhere where somebody can compromise it. Okay, so who uses these accounts? I kind of gave it to you in my introduction there, but usually it's a system administrator. And they're responsible for managing your environment, or an IT administrator using it for specific software, hardware, and things like that. And they can install hardware, they can access sensitive data, they can reset our passwords for us, log into all the machines inside the environment, use elevated privileges to make changes to our IT infrastructure. So you can see that those are very, very powerful accounts. For us in the Unix environment, one of the most powerful is our root account, right? So our root account are the most powerful accounts on our Unix system, as you see here. And without that root account, as you see, it says management security tool to bring accountability. Organizations face several security and non-compliance risks. First of all, there's no safety net. For example, if I take a Unix account or Unix, if I have a Linux or Unix system administrator or administration, it's performed by an admin, and they're tired, let's say, or they're a little careless, there's nothing preventing them from accidentally deleting a system file. Okay, there's no safety net. It's gone, it's gone. No accountability. So if a disgruntled employee uses the account with ulterior motives, there's no way to tell which employee caused the damage to that account. All right. Also, transfer privilege. So if an application is executed using that root account, that application gets the full network privilege of root. So because those applications can contain vulnerabilities, you see how this can create a vulnerability point of exploitation. Be a problem. I mean, ideally, the use of that that Unix root account should be limited, and the utilities that we use, like sudo. If you guys are familiar with sudo, that's one of the ways we can have accountability. But if we have something like sudo in place to raise privileges, we can put that there in order to raise privileges and keep the users accountable, as I stated. So in the case of some type of shared account, as well as for certain configuration changes, root access is going to still be required for us. I'm sorry, let me silence my phone. Be required for us. Now, there was a survey out not too long ago, and that survey said that nearly half of the surveyed organizations have more than 100 privileged accounts. So that's a lot of accounts for us to keep up with. Also, it says more than half of those, 53% of them, have more than 10 administrators that have to have access to those accounts. And more than 27% share passwords among 10 or more administrators. That's really bad, and I'll talk about that later on. And then 2/3 share them among at least 3 administrators. And privileged accounts, of course, as we know, are a big problem. But they're not going away, and often they're going to be the prime source of security breaches if somebody wants to break into our organization. But as I said, these accounts are needed. We have to have them, but they're necessary. So what I want to do right now is I want to talk about some dangers and challenges that we have, okay, from these different accounts, especially these root accounts. Now, those privileged accounts in general, especially in the Unix and Linux environment, they can be used to access your organization's most sensitive data and assets, and I told you that earlier. But due to that nature I told you about of them being siloed, those accounts are going to be hard for us to secure, for us to control and manage and all that. Industry analysts say that from 60 to 80% of all security breaches now involve the compromise of a user or a privileged account password. So doesn't that tell you something? That tells you that we need to do all we can to try to make sure that we are able to secure these types of accounts and put the practices in place that I'm going to talk about today. These are prime targets for attack, folks, and therefore this should be the prime thing that we want to secure, okay? Now, as you all know, you hear this term all the time, privileged accounts give people the keys to the kingdom for any IT environment. I don't care what type of environment, Unix, Linux, Windows, whatever it is. It only takes one compromise, one privileged account compromise for an attacker to gain access to almost all the information that we have in our IT network. And when they compromise our privileged account, they can perform a malicious activity, they can steal our sensitive information, they can commit financial fraud. I used to be a federal agent, so financial fraud can be committed here, all kind of white-collar fraud and crime. And often, they remain undetected for weeks or months at a time. I've seen several of them. I've been victim of several of them. I worked at Booz Allen, and we discovered some things that have been in our system for over 6 to 8 months. Okay, so it's a long time. Now, a study said that most cybersecurity breaches go undetected for more than 200 days. So you can imagine how much damage is done to our systems during all that time. Okay, now let's look at why privileged accounts are prime targets for hackers. Mainly, well, we already said it's the keys to the kingdom, and the danger there is obvious. So they are able to get that privileged account and escalate their privileges to steal information, and probably damage the reputation of our organization also. Okay, so I want to talk about what happens when things go wrong, when they compromise our privileges. And I already told you, with up to 80% of those breaches resulting from stolen or weak passwords or credentials, the path to compromising our privileged account is pretty simple. Okay, the hacker's most preferred pathway is privilege exploitation and then escalating those privileges. Going through things like well, let me show you some of them. Okay, but compromising our end user accounts. So they use malware or social engineering to get access to our desktops, our laptops, our servers, and all that. And our employees are going to be fooled by things. And let me tell you, I even fell victim of the one a week ago, but fooled by phishing scams that ask them to click on a link or download a piece of software with malware hidden inside or something like that. Just 2 weeks ago, I got an email at work. I'm a cyber guy. I got an email at work saying, somebody, you got an award from somebody at work. I'm like, oh, cool, I got an award? And I'm like, I don't know about this. I think this might be something hinky. But I couldn't resist clicking on it, thinking who might have given me some type of award at work. And luckily it was a phishing exercise at work, and it came up with one of the banners that said, had this been a real, a real attempt, I would have been compromised. So me with 30 years of security experience, I still fell for it. So you see how the typical employee can fall for these type of things also. Okay. Privileged account capture. So attackers need a privileged account like that root account to move around throughout your network or your system. So after they compromise your password and they capture it, they can log onto a network and simply bypass a lot of the traditional IT security controls because they appear, as I told you, as an insider, as a user with legitimate credentials. So that becomes a problem. Once they're in there, they have unlimited network access. They can access your core network services. They can remain undetected, as I told you, for weeks or months or perhaps even years. And during that whole time, they're spreading malware, they're stealing your valuable information and all that. And they can compromise your accounts from end users or from privileged accounts that fail to modify and change default passwords. A lot of people, you listen on the phone or on this webinar are probably pretty savvy security-wise. But you'd be surprised how many people in your organization are not. And how many people in your organization that even our IT still don't change default passwords, don't modify their passwords enough, right? And a lot of organizations rely on humans, of course, to generate passwords. We don't do it automatically. They ask us to generate one every 30 days or 60 or whatever your policy might be. And that results in weak passwords that's easily guessed or easily cracked by a determined cyber criminal, especially if they're using some type of automated computer tools that they can use to do that. Okay? And then when you're hacked, well, let me go back to something. I was talking about password, and even with that, another thing that compounds the problem that we have with passwords is that a lot of humans use the same passwords for several different accounts. So if I can get one of your passwords, I could probably open up a whole bunch of your accounts because you want to make it easy for you to remember, so use that same password over and over. And I'm going to tell you, I'm even guilty to that to some extent, or guilty of that. Okay. I'm sorry, let me go back. So what happens when you're hacked? When your privileged account gets hacked, it allows that attacker to impersonate you or impersonate a trusted employee or a system that's trusted. And then again, carry out that malicious activity I talked about without being detected. We look for people breaking in our system, but we don't look at so much what a trusted individual is doing when they're in the system, right? So after they establish that breach, they usually use compromised privileged accounts to perform reconnaissance and learn more about the normal routines of us, the users, or the IT teams that we have. And that includes looking at our regular schedules and looking at the security measures that we already have in place and our network traffic flow and all that kind of stuff. And eventually what they do is they get an accurate picture of our entire network and how our network operates. And their goal is to go back and exploit that later on. Okay? As they learn more about our targeted network, your network, they blend in with normal operations, they avoid detection, and they make sure they don't trigger any network security alarms. And they even learn how to avoid detection. And then their next step is to establish some type of ongoing access by installing probably some remote access tool, and maybe even some rootkits or something to cover their tracks. Okay. So because that compromised privileged account appears to be a legitimate user, it's going to be hard for us to figure out what the root cause of a problem we having is, or perform some type of digital forensics when that breach is eventually detected, if we ever detect it. Okay, so those are some of the things that happens when we're hacked. Now let's look at how we can put a modular and integrated approach into managing those privileged accounts. I'm going to talk about that for the remainder of this presentation, since we got the little intro going in. So first thing we have is that I want you to build a solid foundation. Okay. First, you need to lay that foundation just like you lay the foundation in a house. And so building that solid foundation to manage and secure your privileged accounts is going to help you be more scalable and flexible when you adapt the new technologies that I may recommend or that you may want in your organization. It's key to protecting your critical assets and ensuring only those trusted and those authorized employees across your organization access the right data and the right systems. Okay. Another thing I want you to do is I want you to establish PAM security rules and controls. So an important first step is setting up some rules and controls and policies and things you're going to have in place. Rules like I mentioned earlier, like changing your default IDs and your passwords for your built-in privilege accounts. That should be a standard. Okay, you shouldn't use stuff, of course, straight out of the box. But research shows that 1 in 5 organizations have never changed their default passwords, such as admin or 123 or something like that on their privileged accounts. You have to make sure that this happens. You know, the hackers are looking this stuff up, and they know what if they can figure out what your device is, they know what the password is. You know, the default password. Things like writing a formal password policy, as I said, for your privileged accounts to ensure accountability for that. Okay, they should be based on, you know, the classification of your privileged accounts that's specific to your organization. Okay, and this stuff out there, you can find policy templates online like I do. Go search for that stuff. You don't have to start it from scratch. And then don't allow your privileged accounts to be directly shared, because those shared credentials among your IT administrators is going to make it very easy for any attacker to escalate their privileges or their permissions and gain access to your sensitive information. So we start with that. We start with laying that foundation. Okay. All right, so I'm going to get into this just for a second. I'm going to take another look at something. You could, a few other things that I didn't mention. Let me go back a slide. Things I didn't mention when you're looking at your controls. Monitor and record your sessions for your privileged account activity. You know, make sure that you know that you can enforce proper behavior and avoid mistakes by your employees by monitoring what they do. Control your new privileged account creation with a formal review and approval process. You know, just like your change control process and all that. So I would suggest you use some type of automated software that can run periodic discovery for you to identify new or unauthorized privileged accounts, so you can know that, number one, they're there, and number two, what to do about them. Okay? Evaluate your privileged account to set appropriate expiration dates. They should not last forever. You know, they shouldn't have privileges. They shouldn't be able to, you know, users are going to accumulate privileges over time that they might not acquire anymore. So that needs to be audited and monitored and make sure that they expire and they looked at again. And implement privileged account on-demand usage instead of always on availability. Your privileged account should only get used for a specific task or specific purpose. You know, so on-demand privileged account access means that your user can't access an account directly, but have to go to change management or some type of control point in order to use that privileged access. It might take a little bit longer, folks, but guess what? It's going to make your organization a lot safer when they're doing that. Now, I told you that 80% of the things we have comes from mistakes and compromise and all that. So one of the things I think you should do as part of Module 1 or planning is to make sure that you provide security awareness training to those who are going to be using and are accountable for privileged accounts. Now, I know that we do cybersecurity awareness training for everybody in our organization. Most of you probably do it on a yearly basis, but you have to make sure that there's specific training for those folks, for your IT folks, who are going to, especially the ones that are going to use your privileged accounts, okay? It should emphasize the critical importance of those privileged accounts and the security around them, and include your IT security policies and things like that. They have to be educated too. We take it for granted that our IT folks know what they're doing and know what they shouldn't do. We want to make sure they do. Plus, you can't hold people accountable if you don't first tell them what they're doing wrong, okay, or what how they should be doing things right. All right, and also utilize tools to help you automate. Okay, look for tools that's going to help you automate the discovery, security, protection of those privileged accounts. Any software tools you evaluate should give you ability to continuously discover privileged account, like I said previously, store those privileged account passwords in a safe vault that I mentioned earlier, automatically rotate those passwords on a regular basis, effectively monitor and report on those privileged account activity. You need to know what's happening with your privileged accounts. And then you need to deploy what we call least privilege. My partner called it, I can't remember what word he used, but he said least privilege. He said something like just enough privilege. And that means just enough privilege to get the job done the way you need to have it done. Okay? So utilize those tools that's going to help you. So that's the first part. You lay your foundation with policy, governance, and procedures, right, and training. And then we move into this next part. So here's some steps you can use to lay that foundation. First of all, do a needs analysis. You know, document the needs of your organization. You cannot protect something if you don't know what it is you're protecting. So that should identify the problems that's in your existing business processes that you have. And those resulting requirements should be the map that you use for your technical specifications. And they're going to be fed subsequently into your technology selection and your implementation design that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Again, I mentioned the release privilege principle, so you want to deploy that. You want to plan for your privileged access management at the enterprise platform level. And what I mean by that is that a lot of organizations often find it advantageous to centralize the responsibility for the management of their servers and databases into one internal infrastructure operation team rather than several stovepipe teams spread around the organization. So creating this central team is going to encourage consistency in your configurations of those resources, and it's going to foster consistency in the level of service that you deliver throughout your organization. Okay, and that but what happens though with this, here's one of the problems with security folks, right? This can also increase the risk from privileged access violations, as you have your administrators, they're now able to have privileged access across an entire enterprise rather than just within an individual business unit. So we have to be cognizant of that. What happens is this: if you're going to have a successful PAM program, you have to understand the potential risks of this increase in access by classifying the type of agents that exist within your enterprise and the scope of those agents' access and the operational processes used to manage the accounts for those agents, and then make sure you take a holistic view around that and put something in place to make sure that you monitor it, audit it, and you safe keep those privileges. Okay? Same thing with the application level. You should plan, you should have consideration for how those privileged access is going to be granted, revoked, and monitored around applications and stuff like that. This is part of the system development lifecycle. The benefit is by observing the maintenance phase for applications and the software that failed to do so and all that. I'll have what I want to say, access or insight. That's what I'm looking for as to how this stuff works. Okay. What else do we have? And then controlled selection and layering of the things that you have in place. So here's what I mean. We want to deploy the defense in depth model. I'm sure you all are familiar with that. We want to have security by design, okay? And that should be used, of course, and it is used, I'm sure, when you're choosing your security controls at your enterprise level. And they can be applied for your privileged access management also. So those controls can be applied at both the platform and the application levels. And that's what we want to do. So access management don't have to be all or nothing, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation. But with a lot of organizations, what they assume when they assume access, they assume access has to be privileged or non-privileged. You know, your administrators may need elevated access to do their jobs, but they likely don't need unlimited access to all the information stored on the system for which they're responsible. So some partitioning can take place. As a matter of fact, not only should it take place, it's necessary to keep those administrative duties and information processes separate. That's what we want to have. So for us to go out and achieve a layered security in our management model, you want to consider the value of the information privileged users might be able to access and the potential risk if this information is compromised. All right, next we want to implement the system. Okay, identity consolidation is one of the first things I talk about for implementation. So we know that users are the heart of both the challenges to our solution, the challenges that we have, and they're also a solution. So more specifically, what I mean is that managing user identities and their associated roles and entitlements are important for us. And the objective I have here is straightforward. I want to unify identity across all business platforms. I don't care if it's Windows, Unix, Linux, Mac, whatever it is. I want to reduce silos, and I want to reduce the overall complexity that we have. All right? This part of privileged access management is neglected a lot of times. And we need to make sure we pay attention to that, that is not ignored. So best practice, I'll say, would be to consolidate your Unix, your Linux, and your Mac identities under a single unique ID, perhaps in an Active Directory or something like that, for centralized identity, role, and privilege management, and probably use something like Kerberos-based authentication for those, so you have some safety around it. I want to do account provisioning. So in less control environment that we have, those users are often given privileges on an ad hoc basis. And the user might start out in an overly general user role and have additional rights and privileges added to their account over time. You know, as you work there longer, get more responsibility, it's going to build. But unfortunately, what happens when privileges are granted in this fashion is that they're going to be rarely removed. How many of you all go back, do an audit, and take away privileges of people that don't need them anymore? For instance, I'm a program manager right now, and I'm not really working a cybersecurity role. How many cybersecurity privileges do I still have? Or how many sysadmin privileges do I have from a different role? Okay, so unfortunately, when privileges are granted in this fashion, they're rarely removed. So they accumulate a lot of almost administrative privileges over time without anybody being aware of it. So to combat this, we need account provisioning. Okay, has to be considered in as part of our process. I've talked about this earlier, but I want you to implement password vaulting, because password management in itself can be a chore. You know, all these passwords we have floating around our organization, you know, for our environment, and it can motivate some users to circumvent rules, but of course writing down their passwords. Go into your organization now, turn over any keyboard and see how many passwords are written under those keyboards, you know, or they share them with other people and things like that. So that's a concern for our privileged users, especially, as of course they have those access, that privileged access to a lot of different systems. So we can use a password manager or password vault for this. So that password management tool is going to simplify user interaction by holding that password for those target systems and issuing some type of token or ticket for the target system when administrative duties need to be performed. That makes it a lot safer for us. That user may or may not even see the password, as you know, because that tool might log in on behalf of them. But either way, this places what I want to say a gate between those users and their use of elevated permissions on that system. And that can reduce unintended actions and provide another hurdle for malicious users if they're trying to get into your system. Okay? Utilize emergency access process. That's the break glass I talked about. If there's an emergency and you have to get in, a break glass type style procedure where users have to formally request access to privileged credentials might provide a safer or at least a useful gate for controlling privileged access. Okay? And manage your production code also. So when we go into production promotion, let me start with that. That's the process of moving changes to an application or software into an operational environment. And that's often the source of unrealized privileged access to applications. People don't realize that. That developer does their code in an offline version of the application or software that resides in that test environment or you know, what do we have? We have test or development environment or something like that. And they require the highest level of privileges to do their job at that time. But when they move over, there might be some logic bombs or backdoors or other processes that quietly steal information from us or you know, provide an entryway for folks to break into our system. So those are the things we have to look out for. Let me give you 3 success principles you should put in place. I would recommend you put in place. Limit the rights of those administrators. I talked about that. Native Unix takes an all-access approach, as I told you earlier, to administrative permissions, violating the basic premise that every security manager knows, and that's trust nobody. You know, trust but verify if you want to use that. So we have to make sure that we limit that access, okay? Granting administrators everything they need to do their jobs, but nothing beyond that. That's going to bring a new level of order and common sense to our accounts. Shut down access quickly when necessary. Some companies physically escort terminating employees and contractors off the premises. And although being walked out of the property by a security guard is embarrassing, unfortunately, it's a necessity sometimes. But as soon as those people are gone, you need to shut down access. You need to clean out those accounts and make sure they can't access their accounts. And the last thing, that my third principle, is track administrative activity. A lot of organizations have a system to track what employees are doing, but tracking often doesn't extend to the super users. It needs to hit them also, folks. So existing technology can record those keystrokes and look at, you know, observe the actions and all that in real time. All right. I'm not keeping up with my yellow highlighting, sorry. All right, here's some other things you want to do when you're securing your PAM solutions. Establish PAM security rules. Change the default IDs, I talked about that. Write a formal policy. Don't allow privileged account to be directly shared. Monitor and record all your privileged account sessions so you can see what people are doing. Control your new privileged account creation with a formal review and approval process. Evaluate your privileged accounts to set appropriate expiration dates for them. I talked about that earlier. Implement privileged account on-demand usage. I talked about that. And don't have them always on. You want to be able to do something different than always on availability. Okay. Also, I want to give you real quick 5 steps to mitigate those risks. Take an inventory. Know what you have. You know the users of the system and what they use them for. Okay. Ensure your privileged passwords are stored securely. Enforce strict change management processes, as I mentioned earlier. Whenever possible, ensure individual accountability and least privilege, as I talked about. And important but often forgotten is audit the use of those privileged access. Not just those user accounts, but those privileged accounts need to be audited also, just like anything else. Okay? Now, some top ways to protect your organization here. Establish checks and balances. Those privileged account and privileged account management doesn't have to be, a big challenge for us like it normally is. You need to control, you need to protect, and you need to secure your privileged accounts with those practical tips that I gave you earlier. You might even go into things like keystroke logging and session audits and things, but you want to make this more granular so you can make sure you understand and know what's going on. Okay? Steer clear of manual methods. I said you should automate these. Too many organizations today still rely on, even spreadsheets and things like that to keep track of their privileged accounts. And those manual practices are dangerous and they're also inefficient. You need to automate it. That automated PAM software can be installed quickly and it can manage it with just a little bit of effort. So it's going to make it better for you. It's going to save you time and money, and it's going to greatly increase your protection, which is what this webinar is all about, from hackers and malicious users. I talked about educating employees, very important. Discover and automate the management of those privileged accounts. Limit the IT access. Protect those privileged account passwords by password vaulting. Limit privileged and unknown applications, and choose a partner for your PAM solution. If you don't have the expertise within your organization, then get a partner who can help you do this, okay? To help you control access and the sensitive data, and help you comply with policies and regulations. And ultimately, you know what it's all about? Making your company safer, okay? Look for a solution that's going to automate the identification, understanding of risk to your privileged accounts. If you don't understand it, get somebody who knows how to understand it. That's what I did working for companies as a contractor. And getting to the end here, Module 4, I want to continuously improve my PAM solution, okay? I want to give you a few ways that you can ensure that you have an ongoing improvement process in your auditing your privileged accounts and demonstrating compliance. And the first one is to audit and analyze those privileged account activity. I talked about it earlier, but I need you to examine how your privileged accounts are being used through audits and reports. That's going to help me, you, security folks, spot unusual behaviors that may indicate that a breach or misuse is occurring. Right? Those automated reports can also help you track the cause of your security incidents. Remember I told you you need to get to the root cause? How are you going to stop it, fix the problem, make sure it doesn't happen again if you don't get to the root cause? Okay? Also, when it's time for your compliance and all that, it's going to demonstrate that compliance with regulations, okay? And speaking about that, that's essential in a highly regulated industry if you happen to be in one. When you have to satisfy government mandates, you're going to be, that PAM security is usually considered an essential part of most people's cybersecurity protection strategies. So that's going to demonstrate compliance for you. And then keep discovering privileged accounts. You need a process and automated tools to continuously identify those new privileged accounts and account changes made in your network. It's the only practical way for you to maintain the visibility and the control you need that's necessary for you to protect your critical information. Okay? That's some other things, but the main thing here I want to end up with is that PAM is just one essential component in your strategy. Integrating that PAM as part of the broader category identity access management is going to ensure that you have a safe environment in order to operate in order to work with. It could also be used to improve insights into your vulnerability assessments, IT network inventory scanning, virtual environment security, identity governance, administrative and behavior analytics, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So by implementing a comprehensive plan for PAM security, you can protect your organization from cyber threats. So I want you to go out and I want you to start assessing your privileged Unix and Linux accounts today, all the different accounts that you have. And my partner, Paul, is going to come on right now, and he's going to tell you how exactly you can do that. Paul, you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thanks very much, Derek. All right, so yeah, that was, well, it's a lot of information in a short period of time, and some great advice, and as much as it's good to hear all of that stuff, probably leaves a number of people wondering, just how they're actually going to go about implementing and managing a lot of those controls or safety features, basically, to help protect your network or secure your privileged accounts. So really, that's what Beyond Trust is all about, right? We have a range of solutions that basically help you deal with a lot of those threats and managing your privileged accounts. I've got five, maybe 10 minutes here at the end of this session, so there's no way we're even going to scratch the surface on all the stuff that Beyond Trust as a company offers. But some of the things that Derek was talking about, folding credentials, Active Directory bridge, changing the passwords, automated password changing, managing SSH keys, application access, session management, all of that good stuff. Specifically, though, obviously we're focusing on privilege management, basically how we're dealing with those privileged accounts. And as we're actually going to be laser focused today, or in the last few minutes, on, from my perspective, on PowerBroker for Unix and Linux, which is basically the least privileged tool for the Unix and Linux platform. So, again, one of the things that I hear over and over is the line from Unix admins of "I need root," which basically means, again, Derek was talking about the most highly privileged account on a non-Windows platform or a Unix and Linux platform. Is the root account, and people basically claim that they need it in order to do their job, which may be true. It's highly unlikely, though. Normally they just need access to some part of root. They need to run certain commands or access certain files as root or a privileged account. So that's really what we're in the business to do, is really help the controlled access and auditing of that account. So PowerBroker for Unix Linux basically eliminates the sharing of that privileged credential. So basically no longer does somebody say, hey, I need to log on as root, so what's root's password? We track and audit the activities that are performed under those higher privileges. So you can do things as root. Derek mentioned my favorite saying, which is just enough privilege. Give people just enough privilege to do their job, but they don't need any more. They don't need any less, because obviously that way you're, if that was the case, you'd be impacting that admin or user's performance. But if you give them too much permission and don't track the use of that permission, then you end up with permission bloat, or basically an attack vector, right? For people, if they compromise that account, just like if somebody compromises the root account, you're subject to a much more severe breach. So we're about limiting what that user can do, so that they can do their job effectively without over permissioning that user. PowerBroker for Unix Linux also works at the system level. So what that really means is we don't look at what people type on the command line. Well, we do, but in addition to that, we also look at what the system's going to do. Obviously, Unix and Linux is a very command line driven operating system where people interact with the system primarily through the command line. But what they type and what the system actually does is easy to trick. So we actually look at the system level as well as what they do at the command line level. And then we also extend beyond the actual Unix and Linux platform. Obviously, Beyond Trust as a vendor, we cover all of the main platforms like Windows Desktop, Windows Server, Mac. But PowerBroker for Unix and Linux can also deal with basically anywhere where you SSH, right? So we're not just dealing with a root level account on a Unix box. Maybe you want to lock down somebody that's accessing a router or a switch or a firewall. So really the way the security controls we put in place actually help with any system where you could potentially SSH to that system. So how does it work? Again, we're not going to go overly technical today. The main thing to notice here is, see if I can get my little laser pointer working. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If you think about a system like sudo, basically all of your controls are basically everything is stored here on your client machine. We basically separate that all out, and again, for anyone that's still wondering, we are effectively a replacement for sudo. We also have some tools that help augment sudo. So if you want to continue using sudo, we can make the management and security and login and auditing of sudo much more efficient, much easier for you. But most people choose for a replacement, which basically offloads a lot of the processing to dedicated policy servers and log servers. So things like who can do what, where they can do it, all of the stuff that goes into policy can be stored here, and basically referenced by an external server. Very importantly, though, all of that event log data. So think of it as like a photograph at a moment in time. User Derek ran this command on this host, and this was the result of that command. all actually get stored, again, on a dedicated server away from the actual client. It's never actually, it's not stored on the client and replicated. It's actually written directly to log servers. And optionally, again, one of Derek's great recommendations is make sure that you do session recording, not just for normal user activity, but you know, anywhere where a privileged account or sensitive information is being accessed. So we can optionally turn on a session recorder. Again, all of that data is recorded directly to a separate server. So the big thing really to see with this picture is we separate all of the policy controls, the auditing controls to a separate area of the network, separate servers, separate disk. And then we also make all of that available, you know, obviously from an audit perspective, we can perform analytics on that data, reporting, that sort of stuff. So a couple of other slides. I talked about the fact that we can look at stuff on the system level. Why is that important? Basically, we're basically auditing things like activities inside a script. So again, when you're interacting with the command line, maybe somebody runs a script, you want to know what that script actually done to the system, or what commands were inside, not just that somebody executed a script. It's no good seeing just what they typed on the command line. You need to know what the effect of that action actually was. We can also control things like, you know, file and folder access. Even when you give someone that most highly privileged account of root, we can still control what they're actually able to do, even if the native file system permissions actually allow you to do things. This actually also allows you to stop basically tampered binaries. So again, you could rename a binary, you could symlink to a binary, that sort of stuff. All of those are completely locked down with our policy and controlled. And again, I've already mentioned that we have, you know, an amount of analytics and reporting, so you can actually go and look at all of this information. And again, this is part of that ongoing monitoring. It enables you to, you know, easily search and see what's going on from a review perspective, as well as a forensics perspective. You can have scheduled reports so that, you know, the information just lands in your inbox once a week, once a month, whatever, to review, build your own custom reports, all of that good stuff. So we were scheduled to do a demonstration. Again, I've only got a few minutes left, so I will jump over just for anyone that's curious to see what some of this actually looks like. It's going to be an extremely high-level demo, but just so you understand, again, some of the points I'm going to make reference as we go through all of this. You know, that Derek said was, you know, try and consolidate your IDs, use like a centralized authentication system. So I'm actually going to use a Kerberos sign-on here just to get me logged on to a Unix box. We'll just make this window a little bit bigger so we can see some stuff that's going on. And again, for anyone that's not familiar with what it looks like when you do privilege elevation from a command line, if I was to issue a command like who am I, just reports the user that the command runs as, I can choose to elevate that. Again, it will actually go off to a different server, be authorized. The elevated user is reported back to the requesting user, and it runs as root. This is purely just for demonstration purposes, so you can see what's going on, that it's actually going off and being processed somewhere else. We can do all sorts of clever things here, like when I run certain commands, we can have the user, you know, retype their password. I perform single sign-on to get on using my AD credentials, but maybe I want to revalidate that I actually do know my AD password at this point. So again, if I type in the correct password, then the command's going to run. We can also do really clever things, like we can integrate with ticketing systems. So here I can say, hey, in order to get an elevated session, you know, I've got to provide a ServiceNow incident number, and that could be validated against directly against ServiceNow, whatever requirements you want to have. Is it an open ticket? Is it set to a certain severity level? You know, all of those sort of controls. I actually won't do that just in the interest of time today. And other things as well, if somebody claims that they really do need access to root, you don't actually have to give them the root password. I can let someone elevate an entire shell, and again, in this case, do session recording. So here I've basically elevated user demo into a shell, so he's actually a true root user. And again, he can do everything as root, but again, everything that this user does is going to be fully recorded. We'll just do a few commands here just to generate some data. We'll exit out of there. So last couple of things I will show real quick, and again, this isn't supposed to be a deep dive demo. All of that policy information, first of all, we can discover and deploy all of our software across the enterprise. Then the actual policy itself, that can all be managed here from a web interface. We have various different policy engines. I'll just show you a nice simple one, role-based policies. So in here, we basically break down your policies. I'll just show this elevated shells one because we just did that. where we have the concept of basically who, what, where, and when. And we can just basically select individual users or groups of users, what commands you actually want them to be able to run, privileged shells, basic commands, what host they're allowed to run the commands on. Just the standard policy, who, what, where, and when. You don't have to understand complex policy creation. We'll actually handle a lot of that for you. You can also build, groups of users, so it's just single users, but groups of hosts, groups of commands. If I was to share like my basic command list, so here's a list of commands that a user could run, simply ID, config, top, that sort of stuff. And again, if I just jump over to the reporting interface, again, I won't go through generating reports. I was actually just issuing a few commands like bash, find, who am I. Those are already reported back up here. We can associate risk levels with those. So when I started the root shell with the bash command that got a risk level of 7, I can see in here the submit user was demo. I can see the host I was on, server 2, may not show particularly well over GoToMeeting, but all of the systems that were involved in the authorization of that command. And lastly, this really will be the last thing I show, is I can, and again, there's various ways I can actually search an index of these session logs. Here's a few commands that I've run recently, like within the last couple of days. And if I want to play back that bash shell, even though I didn't have time to put too much in it, I can just choose that as a number, and I can actually play back that entire session, everything that the user saw on the screen. I can move backwards and forwards. I can see, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff I can do. I can see the date and time when commands were issued. I can set it on an automatic playback. I can search for certain text that occurred within that session. And it actually doesn't just limit me to interactive sessions. It also works with, or interactive shells, I should say. You can also do the same thing for, if I'm in an application like SQL Plus, for example, we can see all of that information as well. Okay, so that takes us right almost to the top of the hour. So in the interest of time, I'm actually going to turn this back over to Sarah. I think she's got one more poll to run to wrap up this webinar.
Thank you so much. Okay, guys, last poll. You should see that pop up on your screen. Would you be interested in engaging with one of our security experts further? We would love to chat or take you through a more thorough one-on-one demo of our PowerBroker for Unix Linux, or even one of our other PAM or vulnerability management solutions. So if you select yes, somebody will be in contact with you to schedule that demo. I'm going to leave this up. I know we're approaching the top of the hour, but we had a couple questions come in. Paul, we use sudo today. Is there a migration option from sudo to PowerBroker for Unix?
Yep, it's a great question. I could probably talk for another 10 minutes on that topic alone. So yeah, it's actually very easy to move from sudo to PowerBroker Unix and Linux. Lots of people will wrap the sudo binary so their users can continue, or admins can continue typing sudo. We typically recommend, though, trying to do some sort of process. You get a lot more power. There's, I mean, it's almost like night and day what you can do with PowerBroker Unix and Linux versus sudo. So it's good to use the implementation of a tool like PowerBroker Unix and Linux to reevaluate the controls you've put in place and beef things up. It's a bit like trading in your Mini for a Ferrari and still driving around at 15 miles an hour. If even though you got all that extra horsepower under the hood, you're just not using it if you simply do a straight transfer. But yeah, we've got various migration strategies, and it's really best that we have an interactive conversation around that topic.
Okay, one more question for Derek. At a site with multiple sysadmins, should all of them use one root account, or should they each have their own?
I think Paul would agree with me on this, but it's definitely better to give each sysadmin their own separate account, because those separate accounts are going to make it easier for you to detect account theft, give you a clear picture of who's logging into your accounts. If Paul is out on vacation and he logs in from his account, that should, somebody logs in from his account, that should give us a yellow flag. If his account been stolen, I can deactivate it without locking out all my sysadmins because they're using one account. So, of course, it's much better, unless you think your admins can't be compromised or those accounts can be compromised, it's much better that you give them all their own separate accounts.
Yeah, actually, they should all have their own non-privileged accounts and then elevate to privileges as need be. So really, nobody should have access to a single root account or multiple root accounts. But as each of those non-privileged admins need to do stuff with privileged authority, at that point they elevate just the command or their shell, as I just showed in the quick demo. and that way it removes the need to have multiple root accounts.
If you're a Guardians of the Galaxy fan, they can't go around saying, I am root. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself.
And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks so much, Derek. Hey guys, a reminder too, you will be receiving a follow-up email with the recording and the slides shown here today. It will come from our email alias communications@beyondtrust.com. So make sure that that email is whitelisted so you receive that follow-up without interruption and future webinar invitations. A huge thanks. You guys, great, a lot of content to fit into an hour, so thank you so much for being here today. Paul and Derek, you guys rock, and we will see you guys at the next one. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.